Natalie Nanasi, SMU law professor, thank you so much for joining us. And so yesterday, Governor Abbott announced a crackdown on illegal immigration at the southern border. And two main things really stuck out. One of them is his announcement that, and he'll provide more details next week, that the state is going to build a border barrier, a wall, I guess. What's your reaction about that, and can the state do that in addition to the federal government?
Well, I mean, my initial reaction, it's important, I think, to start with the caveat that you just mentioned, which is that we don't really yet know a lot of details about what this is going to look like. You said barrier, some people are saying wall, some people are saying fence. So I think the devil is really going to be in the details when it comes to what this proposal looks like. I will say what we have to go on is what we experienced in the Trump administration when there were proposals to build a wall along the southern border. And as we know, many of that effort was mired in litigation. The border, as people in Texas surely know, is a complicated place. There's federally owned land, there's state-owned land, there's tribally owned land, there's privately owned land. And so it's not as easy as just saying, we're going to take this land and build on it. So I think it's going to be a complicated effort. And it's really going to largely depend on who owns that land. The other piece of it is that the federal government has the authority to enforce immigration law in this country. And so the reason for that is because we want to have consistency in our immigration laws and in immigration enforcement. And so we don't want the law in Texas and a proposed wall in Texas or barrier in Texas to look different than Arizona, to operate differently than how it operates in California, for example. And so that there's a reason that we want that consistency, and a wall that is going to be just specific to Texas could potentially be really problematic.
Even if it is on state land?
Even if it is on state land, right? Because it's certainly not going to be unbroken, exclusively state land. And so at some point, whatever Texas builds is going to have to match up with whatever the rest of it looks like, either in Texas or in an adjoining state.
And one more question on this particular topic, and that is, what do you think the state, I guess the Attorney General's office is going to have to look at when it comes to, allowing this or making this happen?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're talking about the federal Attorney General.
Well,
State's
I
Attorney
guess
General?
I guess the state, because the state's lawyers are going to have to be working on this, I would imagine, right? But in
Well,
addition to the United States Attorney.
right. And in some ways, we're getting to the heart of the problem already, right? That I think the United States Attorney General is probably going to be interested in looking at this too, as is the Secretary of Homeland Security, because there are existing enforcement measures in place along the southern border. And so the question is, what is already there? How is this proposal going to interact with what's already in place? Again, either with respect to physical infrastructure, like a wall or a fence or something like that, or with respect to personnel, the people that are on the border right now, trying to control immigration into the country.
And then the other part of the governor's announcement yesterday was he announced that there was going to be arrest and confinement for trespassers, those who cross into Texas. And then he also said that there were going to be alternative detention facilities. So I guess that may mean for, families who come over, teenagers, etc. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, again, much like this proposal having to do with some kind of physical barrier, the proposal to do something extra or on top of what's already happening on the federal level with respect to human beings very quickly gets incredibly complicated. Again, as we saw during the increased enforcement that the Trump administration was doing during the southern border, you already have a very complicated in federal infrastructure down on the border, which involves the Department of Homeland Security, the federal department, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection. You have different detention facilities and also different laws that apply to adults, to children, to families who are traveling together. And so inserting yet another entity or set of entities now at the state level into this equation is almost certainly going to cause more confusion. We saw again at the beginning of the Trump administration how families were separated. We're just now starting 4 years later to reunite some of those families. And part of that problem that was happening there is that there wasn't a coordinated effort, there weren't adequate records kept to keep track of people who were moving through this already incredibly complicated immigration system. And thinking about adding, again, another layer to that is incredibly frightening.
And so do you see lawsuits being, do you see the federal government filing suit against the state?
Well, I'm not sitting in any of those rooms and I'm not a mind reader, but I'm guessing that the federal government absolutely will step in and try to prevent this. One of the other really important things to remember is that in addition to Texas not operating in a vacuum here in the United States, the federal government has international obligations to protect vulnerable populations, to ensure that asylum seekers with credible claims are not returned to their home countries. That's something that, as we've seen, the federal government that has the resources to train its employees how to do this. We've seen the federal government struggling with how to do that. And I really worry about what it's going to look like when we start to get local law enforcement involved in making some of these really critical determinations without the adequate training.
Let me ask you, the governor in his remarks yesterday and in the news release that his office sent out, and he's expressed lots of concern about the drugs flowing in, about the humanitarian issues that these people are coming over with. It's obviously a horrific journey from what we've heard from the people who've told us, who've made that journey, how horrific it is. And so I'm wondering, if the state feels as if, it's expressed its concerns, the federal government hasn't done enough to answer those, is the state government essentially maybe forcing the issue, forcing the federal government to do more. What's your thought on that?
Well, I would think that it's hard to imagine the federal government doing more to try to deter immigration than what we saw in the last administration. Right? Where we were, again, separating families, where we were keeping people in Mexico before they were even allowed to enter to apply for asylum, when we were detaining vast numbers of people. And as we saw, that didn't work, right? What that did was that created a backlog of people who, when the restrictions loosened up a little bit to, again, comply with our obligations under federal and international law, that's when people started streaming in. And so, look, Texas is within its rights to offer up certain proposals, but we have to make sure that we're still complying with international and federal law whenever we're trying to do anything. And yes, migration is certainly an incredibly challenging issue, right? We saw Vice President Harris go out and try to address some of the root causes of migration earlier this week. And there are many factors that go into play, which is why I personally think that a coordinated federal response that's really going to take into account all of the issues that are causing people to come here and how to address that in a way that is safe for everybody and responsive to the needs on the ground is the best way to move forward, and not kind of a piecemeal state by state approach.
One other thing is I know that the Republicans have said that under President Trump, the stay in Mexico policy, while their cases were, going through the process, did work because people didn't cross. And so what do you say to that? When they say, look, it was working, and yes, there's a backlog, but there's been a backlog for years, but it kept the people out of the United States while those claims were being processed. What do you say to that?
Well, I think there are two things there. One is that anytime, I think of it like a bucket that has a number of holes in it, right? You can try to plug one hole, but that water is still going to come in, especially if that water needs to get out of that bucket, right? It's sort of an imperfect analogy, but the idea is if we close off one migration route, people are coming here because they are desperate, because they are unsafe, because they cannot stay where they are. And so they are going to try to find another way to come. And often what we're doing is that we're pushing people into less safe corridors of migration and endangering their lives and their safety. So that's the one thing. The other is, sure, we were able to corral people in Mexico and keep them from entering the United States. That was not a long-term solution, right? The first part of that is that the conditions in which people were in Mexico were absolutely horrific, right? It was not safe for them with respect to crime. They were not adequately housed. They didn't have food. With COVID rampant, people were getting sick. It was like not even something that you would call a refugee camp, right? It was basically forcing people to live in homeless conditions. And we're talking about adults as well as children for months on end. And again, you can see the fact that people stayed there, right? The fact that people waited their turn to try to come in, the people that stayed there despite those horrific conditions in an effort to comply with the law really shows you how absolutely horrific it is for them back in their home countries that they were willing to endure that. The other thing is that ultimately that was not deemed to be either a lawful or a humanitarian way to proceed. And so, again, once we started letting people in, get to comply with our legal obligations, you saw that now we had this backlog of people who we were now going to have to process anyway, right? Like, there's not a reasonable solution to this problem that just says we're going to seal off all our borders and never let anybody in ever again. It's not the way that the reality of the situation is.
And one thing that the Biden administration has said is that it's still sending people back under Title 42 because of COVID. So they say that they're returning people back to their home countries. It's the unaccompanied minors who are staying, and those who have a legit, I guess, asylum claim, right?
Right. Well, and again, it's certainly important to deal with the most vulnerable populations first, right? To make sure that they're able to safely enter, right? So that the Title 42, which used the public health crisis as a reason to either expel or to keep people out of the United States, Biden lifted that with respect to unaccompanied children. And again, we saw that because of that bottleneck, once that was lifted, we saw a lot of kids coming in at once, but that migration has regularized, and we've been able to deal with it. We had the facility here in Dallas, and now those kids are no longer here because we've been able to place them with relatives and into safer locations. And yeah, I mean, look, we have an obligation towards asylum seekers. We cannot return them without proper screening to ensure that we're not sending them back to a place that their lives are going to be at risk. And so that's going to trump any public health concerns, especially as we see, thankfully, more people getting vaccinated and the COVID crisis at least abating slightly.
SMU law professor Natalie Nanasi, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
All right, thank you so much for having me.